Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from today, the Bunurong people of the southeastern Kulin Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Annabella Newton, and I'm a Senior Associate in the Chemistry and Life Sciences group here at Phillips on One Fitzpatrick. I'm based in our Melbourne office here in Australia and delighted to be presenting this snapshot to you today. It's been a very long couple of years with very little international travel here in Australia, but Melbourne is now open again and it's a great city and well worth a visit. So please do come and see us, buy you a coffee. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in to this snapshot about Pharmaceutical Patent Term Extensions, or PTEs. Part of my role here at POF involves specialising in PTEs, and I really enjoy working in this space. There's a lot of litigation and public scrutiny, and there are some great court battles. Now, obviously, Australia is not alone in having PTE provisions. There are similar provisions in many other countries, such as supplementary protection certificates in Europe and the Hatch-Waxman provisions in the US. Our neighbours in New Zealand do not have any PT provisions. Australia is the only trans-Tasman country that has these provisions. But regulatory approval is often sought later in Australia than in other countries, and this results in trailing PT protection in a global context. And so strategies for getting the best out of PT in Australia can get lost or forgotten, and the system does have its own quirks. And so over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll be letting you know what the requirements in Australia are for PTE, what sort of patent claims can be extended, and why it's good to have this in mind during prosecution. My real headline, sort of up front, is that an Australian PTE must be based on the earliest approval of any pharmaceutical product that is disclosed and claimed in the patent, and this can include products of another party. And therefore, pharmaceutical patentees should be aware of which products fall within the scope of their claims, and where multiple products are claimed, patentees should consider using divisional applications to focus on different specific pharmaceutical products. And competitors should perhaps take a look at competitor PTEs to make sure that they are based on the earliest approved product within the scope of the claims. So moving on to the requirements for PTE in Australia. These are covered by sections 70 to 79 of the Patents Act and provide an extension of term of up to 5 years for a patent which meets the following requirements. The patent must relate to one or more pharmaceutical substances per se, and/or one or more pharmaceutical substances when produced by a process which involves the use of recombinant DNA technology. And I will unpack all of these requirements a little more in coming slides. The patent must also, the pharmaceutical substance must be disclosed in the patent specification and fall within the scope of at least one claim of the patent. Goods containing or consisting of the pharmaceutical substance must be included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or the ARTG. And the difference between the patent date and the first regulatory approval date must be at least 5 years, and the patent cannot previously have been extended under these provisions. So the PT can be based on a single claim of the patent, but the term of the patent as a whole is extended. That said, there are some limitations during the extended term, particularly exploitation of any form of the invention that is not a pharmaceutical substance, or exploitation of pharmaceutical substances for non-therapeutic uses do not constitute infringement of the patent during the extended term. And now turning to unpack some of these requirements a little more. So pharmaceutical substances, these definitions are pretty important. Pharmaceutical substances per se, this refers to compounds, compositions, and mixtures intended for therapeutic use. It does not extend to that therapeutic use, so the claims have to be product claims, not process claims or second medical use claims. The second part of this definition does introduce a bit more wiggle room, where the pharmaceutical substance is produced by a process that involves the use of recombinant DNA technology. So this language was introduced into the Patents Act in the early 1990s, when recombinant DNA technology was pretty new. And now, obviously, it is widely applied and many drugs are manufactured using this technology. And it opens up the possibility of extending some process claims where they relate to the use of recombinant DNA technology. And so here are some examples of claim formats which cannot generally be extended. And as you'll see, these include sort of use limitations and second medical use claims and method of treatment claims. So where there are clear indications of therapeutic use and Swiss style claims. Australia is fairly unique in that most second medical use claim formats are allowable here. And we have a clear higher court decision indicating that method of treatment claims and Swiss claims are actually construed slightly differently, but neither are eligible for patent term extension. Claims which are limited to a particular environment or have explicit method or process steps are generally not considered eligible for PTE. And claims which get a bit specific about the amount of substance may not be PTE eligible, but this is not absolute. So a specified quantum is generally considered to be a feature of a pharmaceutical substance per se if it is relevant to achieving a chemical or physicochemical interaction with the human physiological system. So a fair amount of leeway is granted here, and particularly claims relating to dosages or dissolution profiles can be eligible for PTE in Australia. I also have a bit of a question mark next to this EPC 2000 style claim because they are a bit up in the air at the moment. Generally, you have been able to get patent term extensions for some of them because they are not construed as use limited in Australia. Obviously, they're a popular second medical use claim format in many other countries, but in Australia, this for use language is generally taken to indicate a suitability for use rather than a limitation. And we've just had a federal court decision which has cast some ambiguity on that with regard to patent term extensions. So this particular claim format is a bit of a watch this space in Australia at the moment. And here are some examples of claim formats which can be extended. In practical terms, you can generally obtain patent term extension not just for new APIs, but also for new formulations, compositions, novel mixtures, and the term can also include some devices if they can be claimed as compositions. For example, polymeric drug delivery devices have been eligible for patent term extensions here. Claims for new salts, polymorphs, and enantiomers generally would be considered claims for pharmaceutical substances, although they may have fallen down for other reasons during prosecution, such as novelty or inventive step. You can also have extensions for some product by process claims in the recombinant DNA tech space. So these claims don't need to explicitly refer to DNA technology in the process, but they do have to be able to include it. And some process claims, explicit process claims, have been considered eligible, but only where the process can only be carried out by recombinant DNA technology. And so Australia's system extends only to pharmaceutical substances per se and does not generally include veterinary products, as these are subject to a different regulatory process in Australia. Moving on to this requirement, where the pharmaceutical substance must be both disclosed and claimed in the patent. And the first part really means that there must be a real and reasonably clear disclosure of the pharmaceutical substance in the specification. And this is a similar requirement to a fair basis or support test. An example of the specific compound or composition is ideal, but a broad disclosure of a class of compounds is also usually sufficient. And the second part means that the substance itself must be the subject of a claim or claims. So claims that refer to the substance in a particular environment are not considered to, in substance, claim the pharmaceutical substance. For example, claims to the substance in combination with other integers or as part of a method or process claim. They would not be considered claims to, in substance, the pharmaceutical substance. And moving on to the first regulatory approval date. And this is a pretty important date, and it's generally defined as the date of commencement of the first inclusion in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods of goods that contain or consist of the substance. But the substance can be any pharmaceutical substance that is disclosed and claimed within the patent. So in other words, this date is the earliest date on which at least one substance falling within the scope of the claims received regulatory approval in Australia. And we've recently had 2 higher court decisions which confirm this position. And so there are various ways in which goods can be included in the ARTG, which are listed here. But registered goods is the most common way. All of these are relevant for PTE, but registered goods is what we see most of the time. And so this is an important date for 2 main reasons. Firstly, it usually sets the deadline to apply for patent term extension. This deadline is either 6 months from the date of grant of the patent or 6 months from the date of first regulatory approval, whichever is later. And marketing approval usually comes after patent grant. And so this later date is usually 6 months from the date of first approval, and that's usually your deadline to apply. The second reason it's an important date is because it calculates the length of extension available. The extension available is the gap between the patent date, usually the filing date, and the first regulatory approval date, reduced but not below 0 by 5 years and capped at a maximum for 5 years. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but in other words, if your marketing approval happens at 9 years after your filing date, your extension available would be 4 years. If your marketing approval happens 11 years after your filing date, then the extension available would be 5 years. If your marketing approval happened 4 years after your filing date, then the extension available would be 0. So this first regulatory approval date can be problematic when multiple products fall within the scope of your claims. An earlier registration can affect the PTE, even if it is for goods belonging to a third party. And this is true where the product is present in an earlier registered good, even if it's as an impurity or a salt or an enantiomer. It can affect the length of the PTE available, maybe even reducing it to 0, and it can also affect the deadline to file. And this can obviously have significant impacts on the commercial outcomes for patent term extension. That said, it's also possible to extend more than one patent based on the same registration in Australia. And so you can file more than one divisional, you can file one or more divisional applications focused on the pharmaceutical product. And Australia has pretty generous divisional applications. They must be filed while the parent is still pending or shortly after acceptance. And therefore, it's important to think about these things during prosecution to make sure that you have these options later on when regulatory approval is obtained. And that's really my main headline message from this presentation. Because an Australian patent term extension must be based on the earliest approved product that is both disclosed and claimed in the patent, and this includes goods of a third party, it's important to be aware, for pharmaceutical patentees, it's important to be aware of which pharmaceutical products fall within the scope of the claims. And where multiple products are claimed, consider using divisional applications to focus on the different products. Competitors could also consider taking a look at competitive patent term extensions to make sure that they are based on the earliest approved product within the scope of the claims. And that's all I really have time for in this snapshot. Obviously, it's quite a quick overview of Australia's patent term extension requirements. But if you have any questions about this, then feel free to send me or the firm an email and give us a call if you have any further questions. Here are our details. My colleagues and I would love to have a chat. If you'd like a more detailed presentation about this topic, then we'd be happy to set up a workshop or something similar to work through your questions. Obviously, this is a really rich area of Australian patent law. It's very hard to cover in 10 to 15 minutes. We've had a lot of decisions recently from the Australian Federal Court and High Court in this area, and it's yeah, there's a lot of great court battles, so it's a very fun area. But yes, we'd love to discuss it more. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention, and take care and stay safe. Thank you.